Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You have joined the Asia and Pacific Transport Forum 2020. And this virtual session is named Taking Off During the COVID Storm, Challenges in Reopening International Aviation in the Asia Pacific region. My name is Lee Dong-gyu, also known as DK among my colleagues. Please address me as DK. And I'm the Director of Transport and Communications Division in Pacific Department at ADB. I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for this session. So in this session, we're going to talk about aviation and COVID-19. I would not be able to think of any other topics that are more intertwined at this time. Undoubtedly, the aviation sector is suffering its worst ever decline in traffic. Many countries, including in Asia and the Pacific region, have closed their international borders. Many airlines have grounded almost all aircraft in their fleets, in fact, looking for parking spaces in major airports. It has impacted almost every facet of our lives. Before the pandemic, I was a frequent flyer due to my work, traveling on average around every 5 weeks. I have not boarded any aircraft since I came back from my mission from Cook Islands in late January. So the unparalleled actions taken to slow down the spread of the virus are also causing severe impacts on economies and the financial conditions of the airlines, airports, and the industries that depend on aviation, especially tourism. Recently, I read an interesting article in the BBC News, which highlighted 10 countries in the world with no recorded COVID-19 cases. All 10 countries are in the Pacific region: Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Nauru, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Samoa, Vanuatu, and Tonga. Yet, without infecting a single person, the virus has devastated these countries. The restaurants are empty, the souvenir shops are shut, and the only hotel guests are returning residents in quarantine. In short, you can keep the virus out, but you cannot beat it. So COVID-19 will get you one way or the other. Another interesting fact, according to the Asian Development Bank's Pacific Economic Monitor issued in July, the forecasted falls in GDP during this year for these countries are going to be extraordinary. For example, 9.8% for Vanuatu, 9.5% for Palau. The post-COVID-19 economic recovery in Asia and the Pacific is being forecasted in different scenarios based on different assumptions. Could be V, could be U, even W or L. However, the resurgence of the aviation industry is crucial in any recovery scenario. With this in mind, this session aims to examine the relevant issues and challenges and exchange experiences and viewpoints from different organizations. We hope this will provide a comprehensive vision on fostering an integrated approach to reopening international aviation. In this context, I'm happy to introduce the 6 speakers for this session. They are distinguished experts in their respective fields. First speaker is Mr. Arun Mishra. He is the Regional Director for Asia and Pacific Office of the International Civil Aviation Organization, also known as ICAO. He will provide ICAO's efforts and viewpoints on managing the COVID-19 crisis as a global civil aviation authority. Second speaker is Mr. Charles Schlumberger. He is the lead air transport specialist with the World Bank. He will describe the World Bank's effort and viewpoints on supporting the aviation industry to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. The third speaker is Mr. Patrick Osewe. He is the chief of the ADB's Health Sector Group. He will share insights on the health-focused recommendations for safely reopening international aviation. The fourth speaker is Mr. Hamad Abdul Ghani. He is the Deputy Minister for Transport and Civil Aviation of the government of Maldives. He will share his government's concerns and interventions for the pandemic, especially for the countries heavily relying on tourism. The fifth speaker is Mr. Andre Virjoen. We're really glad to have him here. He's the Managing Director and CEO of the Fiji Airways. He will share airlines' views on survival and sustainability under COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the sixth speaker is Mr. Rene Hopsteken. He's the Senior Consultant for Security and Airport Systems with NACO, a company of Royal Haskoning DHV in the Netherlands. He will share consulting firms' knowledge and experience in the technologies and best practices for supporting international civil aviation to reopen. Once again, thanks to all speakers who are donating their valuable time here. With this, we will proceed with the session in three parts. Part one will provide 5 minutes to each speaker for opening statement, viewpoints, and experience. Part two will be a structured panel. I will be asking one round of questions to each speaker based on respective experience and background. And finally, part three will be Q&As with the audience. For this, we are inviting audience to send in questions through the Q&A box of the Zoom at any time throughout the session. Again, you can send your questions through the Q&A box of Zoom at any time throughout the session. You may also wish to address your questions to a specific or any speaker. Then my colleague Quan Cheng will immediately start organizing the questions to be addressed during the Q&A session. With this, now we'll begin with part one and give 5 minutes to each speaker. We'll proceed in the order of introduction. So we'll start with Mr. Arun Mishra from ICAO.
Thank you, Donkyu, for the excellent introduction to this problem which you are facing. Yeah. Can we have the slides, please? I have a very brief presentation on what ICAO is doing and what we specifically in Asia Pacific are doing, and also highlight a couple of challenges which we are facing while working through this crisis. Next slide, please. So right from the beginning of the pandemic, ICAO acknowledged that international air transport being a fundamental component of modern society, and that is smooth and safe restart is essential to the recovery of the global economy. ICAO Council constituted a Council Aviation Recovery Task Force comprising of ICAO Council members and representatives from the industry and international organizations. This task force submitted its report in early June, and since then, most of the 193 member states and industry partners have adopted the recommendations in the report and started the implementation. The main purpose of the CART report and guidelines is to provide member states and industry with the ability to implement harmonized risk mitigation measures in full accordance with the latest and most prudent medical and traveler health advice available to us. As we all are aware, globally and regionally harmonized, mutually accepted measures are essential for safe operation of international civil aviation. Such measures must be compatible with safety and security requirements, proportionate to the improvement of public health, flexible where possible to allow for viable economic recovery, and safeguarded not to distort markets. Measures that impose costs or burdens on the industry must be carefully considered and justified by safety, public health, and confidence of passengers and crew. So these are the CART report and the accompanying documents are all available on our ICAO public website. Next, please. So the CART report was accompanied by a takeoff document developed in close coordination with WHO and our industry partners, which details the public health risk measures covering 4 modules of airports, aircraft, crew, and cargo. This document provides a checklist covering more than 170 parameters in the 4 modules, which aims at providing necessary support to both the regulators and service providers for a safe restart. In ICAO, we have developed a monitoring tool to assess the progress made by states in respect of implementation of the measures detailed in these guidelines. Next, please. So what is the CART implementation mechanism in the Asia Pacific region? The ICAO Asia Pacific COVID Contingency and Recovery Planning Group is an initiative of the Director Generals of Civil Aviation of Asia Pacific, who decided to form a group to assist the DGCAs in coordinating their approach to the management of civil aviation through and out of the current extraordinary circumstances. The major focus of the ACC RPG is to assist DGCAs with coordinating states' implementation of the recommendations of ICAO's CART report, including the takeoff document. The ACC RPG reports to the DGCAs of Asia Pacific on the progress of and proposes recommendations, actions as necessary to facilitate the implementation by the states of the CART recommendations. The first ACC RPG progress report has identified 6 key factors that states across the Asia Pacific region will need to consider implementing the restart and recovery of international aviation, and also provided 11 initial recommendations to all Asia Pacific states to help them prioritize the key actions that should implement to ensure safety, security, and sustainability of aviation while reducing the risk to passengers, aviation staff, and the community from COVID-19. Next, please. So I'll come straight away to the challenges. So after having worked for about 5 months with the states and our industry partners and international organizations, we have identified some challenges which are critical to opening of air transport. Now, the first one is opening of international borders are decided by higher level authorities, and the civil aviation authorities in most states do not have much role to play in these decisions. Further, the health measures for travelers and crew also fall beyond the realm of civil aviation authorities. Thus, there exists a gap between the various authorities within a state, which is further compounded by states, some of the states which are following a federal system of governance, where rules are differently applied to different provinces, posing a real challenge to international travelers as well as transit passengers. For example, in Australia and India. Secondly, the need for a uniform, harmonized approach, a goal which ICAO is advocating, is presently elusive, as we have diverse measures adopted by states, creating barriers for smooth recovery. And thirdly, it seems that testing and quarantine measures adopted by states remains the biggest hurdle for international travel to resume both for business and leisure. While ICAO is presently working with WHO to find a suitable proxy for the 14 days institutional quarantine, which most of the states have imposed, this will depend on the level of transmission in a particular state and the importance and the priority accorded by the state to the recovery of aviation. Next slide, please. So as a way forward, we would like to promote partnership and collaboration between public health and civil aviation authorities so that there is a mutual recognition of each other's requirements and limitations. And further, a risk-based gradual approach needs to be evolved wherein we use travel bubble concept between countries which are similarly placed in terms of community transmission. So that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mishra. We'll go to the speaker, second speaker, Mr. Charles Schlumberger from the World Bank.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to Asia. I'm greeting you from yesterday. I'm greeting you from Washington, D.C., where it is evening and where the political heat is hot, but virtual, where we see debates. Everything started a few days ago in view of the elections. We will talk today about COVID. We will talk about the impact on the air transport sector. I'm at the World Bank in charge, technically responsible for everything that is air transportation globally. The bank has a portfolio of about 70 activities, projects around the globe, about close to $1 billion, it was higher before, portfolio, and is active in the development of air transportation. Let's go to the first slide. COVID-19 had a tremendous and has a tremendous impact. Press again. We expect a world GDP decline of 5%, trade going down about a third, very significantly impact on tourism, 1.2 trillion. You all know the world GDP is close to 70 trillion. So it's about 2% of world GDP affected of a tourism revenue decline. Passengers, less than half. Airport revenue, 79 billion decline. Airline revenue, 420 billion. And we have researched, we count right now about 26 airlines that are already bankrupt. Many more are close to in receivership. So there's a tremendous impact on the air transport industry. Now, we in the World Bank, we are not in the aviation business. We are not here to finance aviation. We are here in economic development, poverty reduction, and we have different modes, of which one is transport, and in transport is air transport. So when we look at air transport, we basically look at three components. We look at airlines, we look at airports, and we look at air navigation service providers. These are the three main components, with many other ones that consist the infrastructure of air transportation. The most vulnerable of all are the airlines that are never really profitable. Very hardly they earn the weighted average cost of capital, and they often struggle. They are the most hit right now. Therefore, I'm concentrating just on airlines, but of course, airports, air navigation service providers as well are in difficulties. Now, let's go to the next slide and let me talk about support for airlines. 78 countries around the world have reported support for the airlines. And you see here a little chart with different colors. A total of 155 billion US dollars are confirmed as proposed or as state aid to support airlines. 53%, the lion's share, is the United States with 58 billion to their airlines. Let's go to the next slide. What is interesting though is, what is the proportion of this support of the whole COVID response? Because let's face it, every single sector is affected by COVID, every single sector. And very interesting is this chart on the right side where you see India, of its COVID response, is at 0.02% for the airline share. Latvia, nearly 40%. And if you go to the United States, which is a huge figure, 58 billion, well, that's only 2.4% of the trillions that have already been released on a COVID response. So certain countries' weight to support much, much more important than other ones. Let's go to the next slide. So the World Bank has already engaged with certain countries on the COVID response. And how can an international development institution like the World Bank or the ADB respond and help the client countries? And there are basically three ways to do that. One is, of course, the policy advice and options, how to tackle with the emergency, what can be done. But what is important is we are looking at the country as a whole, we are looking at the economy as a whole, we are looking at the sectors. We have to do choices. We have to weigh the importance of the aviation sector. We saw it in the chart, between 40% and 0.02% of the response goes to the aviation sector around the world. We can also do technical advice and technical support. And finally, what the name bank implies is we can finance. So let's quickly run through these three options so that I stay in the 5 minutes. Next slide, please. So, as I already said, in the policy advice, we need to make an analysis of the economy, of the system, of the country as a whole. What are the priorities? And in some countries, aviation is not a priority. In other countries, aviation is absolutely crucial for the economy. We just heard some examples of Pacific Islands where the World Bank has a big program in various states. Their aviation is important. Then what are the policy options for the aviation sector that we could address? Of course, financial support for an airline or a liquidation. Mobilizing finance for development, maybe joint ventures. There are different options to tackle the aviation sector's challenges. Then also we need to ask the question, what are the alternatives for bailout? And there are conditional support, there are more partnerships, and there are guarantees to look at. Let's go to the next slide. So in technical advice, concretely now for airlines, we have three types of work we are doing. And we actually have three cases that we have worked on, or we are still working on, from concrete airline restructuring, where we provide technical support in Uzbekistan in terms of a reimbursable advisory service, where we act as the consultants. In Cape Verde, I have been working for 15 years, where we helped the government to privatize the airline. And some time ago, 2 decades ago, there was the last liquidation of an airline which we support a country, was Air Afrique. These are basically the three technical advice forms we can give. Next slide. So when we finance airlines, yes, we do state-owned airlines. It was done last time 3 years and 5 days before I was born in 1975. We financed $22.1 million to Air India to acquire airplane. Since then, we have not financed any state-owned airlines. However, we have done so with through IFC on the private side. It's not excluded, but what kind of financing and what kind of conditions and what kind of policy options are attached needs to be discussed, because just providing money for an airline that is not viable is not the development move that makes sense. Of course, there's indirect financing that sometimes happens, development policy operations, where funding is linked to certain triggers, certain conditions, certain policy options, that could, of course, provide liquidity to the budget, which a government could use to support the airline. It's called an indirect financing. And then, as I mentioned, the private sector, IFC or MIGA, but this is a pure commercial approach. And in the state that the airlines are today, that's a very difficult way forward. And I think we come to the last slide. So I think this is the most important chart here, the decision tree that we have developed to look at supporting air carriers. Actually, very simple way forward. You have an airline that is in serious financial distress due to the pandemic. Yes, the carrier needs support for survival. So the next question is very important. Would the loss of the carrier have a severe impact on the connectivity and the economy of the country, or would it not have? Very important here is, yes, it has. Then direct support needs to be considered. Or no, it does not, because if the airline disappears, there are many other airlines that would take over. So if it disappears and it's not essential, then there is only the option to divest or to liquidate and maybe help the government to do that. However, more challenging is if the carrier is viable in a post-pandemic market. That's the question to ask. We have a few airlines that we have been asked now to provide support which before COVID already were in distress. If they are not viable in a post-COVID market, the only option that actually often results to the government is to help them to liquidate the airline. If it is, and a restructuring is possible, then we move forward to restructure, maybe help to recapitalize, but also the option of divest. Here, we always aim at participation of the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schlumberger. So we'll move on with the next speaker, Mr. Patrick Osewe from ADB's Health Sector Group.
Thank you very much for inviting the Health Sector Group to be part of this very illuminating discussions on how to restart the economy. For those of us who work in the health sector, after the last pandemic in 2000, the major pandemic in 2003, the SARS pandemic, and then the H1N1 in 2009, we've had lots and lots of discussions regarding how can countries prepare for the next big pandemics. And there've been lots of engagements led by WHO and other organizations worldwide to prepare countries for this. But we never realized that the next big pandemic would be this devastating. And I think that Arun and Charles have set out, have defined the problem very well. So I'll just talk about what we, ADB Health, we've been doing, collaborating with other partners across sectors to try and solve this problem. Next slide, please. As part of our engagement and also trying to support the travel and tourism, we've been working very closely with Arun, who is part of the panel, International Civil Aviation Organization, International Air Transport Association, IATA, the Airport Council International, the Pacific Asia Travel Association. This is an association that looks at the small players in the travel industry. You know, like if in tourism, the boat operators, the taxi operators, and all those people, and there are some of the smaller hotels, and then the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. We also engaged many airlines across the world. We talked to Fiji Airways, Air New Zealand, Bangkok Airs, many airlines to try and come up with what would be the best solution. What are they thinking about? What type of protocols are being put in place to try and solve this problem? Next slide. We also talk to travel agents because they get a lot of feedback from travelers. We talk to some of the resorts worldwide. We talk to the largest hotels in the world, like Marriott, the Hilton Hotel, and many other entities that are involved in businesses in some of the tourist areas, like the 7-Eleven Corporation. We also talk to academic institutions. Next slide. So out of that, it was quite clear that there's so much that is going on. For example, hotels are coming up with their own protocols. The Hilton, for instance, has a clean stay protocol. The Marriott, they have theirs. The small entities have theirs. There's also a lot of digital information in terms of various apps being developed, an app from Australia, an app from Singapore, an app that was being tried, an app in Korea, and so on. There was also many procedures that some of the airlines were doing. For example, at that particular, the 2 months ago, Emirates was saying that everybody had to be tested for COVID at the airport and so on. Lots of discussions that were going on. We talked to Boeing as the aircraft manufacturer to look at is it safe to be in the plane if someone, for example, is asymptomatic and has COVID. We looked at the filtration system in the aircraft, and also looked at various joint approaches that were being done by KO, IATA, the Airport Council International, and so on. Next. So out of all that, we found out that there are 12 main documents that have been reviewed, peer-reviewed across all the industries. And our focus was not just aviation. We were looking at the entire travel journey. If you leave your home or you leave your employment and you want to go to the next point, is that you take a taxi, you go to the airport. Within the airport, there are many ministries that are involved in the private sector. The airline is a private sector. security check in the Ministry of Home Affairs or Ministry of Internal Security. You also have to go through the airport is owned by the Ministry of Transport. Immigration is another ministry. And then when you leave, customs is the Ministry of Finance. So there's so many ministries that constitute what you call an airport. And therefore, how do you bring all of them together to begin to understand and to collaborate toward this major effort? So there are 12 documents that we looked at. Out of those, plus many other discussions that were ongoing, there were 275 individual health and safety focused recommendations that we reviewed. And out of that, we consolidated all those into 4 categories that I'll share in a minute. And then we validated these ones with global experts across the entire industry and came down to 25 health focused policy recommendations that could be considered. Next slide, please. And then we also looked at after we did that, we had a whole Zoom conversation with the various experts to brainstorm and to see which recommendations were really critical, which recommendations were driven by technology, which technologies were which recommendation were the role of government, international organizations, and so on. And then the next step now is to use those recommendations to focus on a few countries. For example, as ourselves, WHO, ICAO, and other UN members, we are discussing collaboration with the government of Fiji and some of the surrounding islands. Next slide. So basically, this is my last slide. So the 4 areas that that's been recommended is that there needs to be a very strong management and planning, because like I mentioned, this involves many sectors, many players, some big, some small, some private, some government, some small SMEs, and so on. So management and planning is extremely essential to look at this problem within the airport and within the country and so on, and to oversee how the recommendations are being implemented. The second part was how to introduce transmission barriers and working with various stakeholders to minimize touch points and using integrated technology and enabling automation. There's a lot of innovation that is going on across the sector. For example, in our hotel in Fiji, you can basically just check in and do everything at the hotel. When you go to the airport, you just go straight to through security and to the gate. So lots of technological innovation going on in this area. The third one is enhancing sanitation. Sanitation is something that has been weak in the travel industry. So how do you look at the issues of sanitation, the medical waste, and also rather the waste that is being generated? Right now, for example, there's a lot of usage of PPEs. What do you do with the mask that you've used and you want to throw it out? Where do you place it, and so on? So looking at the entire waste within the hotel industry, within the airport, within the travel, all those things have to be enhanced. And lastly is promoting health screening. Right now, there's a very disorganized system of health screening. One country wants to enter the country, you need a COVID test within 96 hours. But in some country, it takes 120 hours to get a COVID test. So all these policies and policies are the ones that are undermining travel. So we are also doing hackathon in these 4 areas that will close at the end of the month. At the end of this month, it's been going on for the past 6 weeks to come up with the best innovation to try and solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Osawe. The next speaker is Mr. Hamad Abdul Ghani from the government of Maldives.
Hi, thank you, Don. I'm happy to be here participating in this forum to give a brief of those countries that are heavily reliant on tourism and air transport, which fuels tourism in these countries as well. Maldives is a unique country that's spread across different islands. We are not a landlocked country, which is certainly a blessing in this situation, because one of the key points of our success or our main ease has been to stop the pandemic spreading, has been the fact that we have isolated islands spread across from the north to the south. Aviation is an industry of national strategic importance to the Maldives. The wide dispersion of population, it's coupled with the remote location, means air transport is the link that connects people with each other and the rest of the world. It is also important to highlight that tourism, which we in Maldives say that aviation is tourism and tourism is aviation. Tourism results in about 10% of the GDP in the Maldives. So when the COVID pandemic hit us, it was really the most important. It was really the most important step for us to react to it, and then to make sure that the industry survives even after the pandemic. So we took some drastic measures. I think we were one of the first countries, along with Kazakhstan, I think at the time, to stop flights coming in or passengers coming in from China, which was the epicenter of the pandemic. Then we moved on a country-to-country based approach, where we stopped Italian passengers and then we stopped the Spanish passengers. But then it reached a point where we just didn't have a choice. It was spreading so drastically that we just had to stop all airlines coming in, and that proved to be really detrimental to the industry, as everybody knows in this forum. One of the major things that we faced is that the local tourism, the local air transport industry and the aviation professionals has faced issues of being furloughed. They've lost jobs. Some of the airlines are filing for administration. And these issues are being countered by the government by providing financial incentives as one. Secondly, we are helping the aviation professionals and all the professionals in industries to make sure that even after the pandemic, they still have some sort of kickstart to their career. So we're giving income support allowances, and just like the US giving out stimulus paychecks. We are also focusing on making sure that the economy restarts. And I'm sure that all of you have noticed that Maldives has been one of the countries to have no restrictions on quarantine, no restrictions on testing as well. And I think people might find it a bit brash, and it might come off as we're taking a risk. But I think even in my next opportunity, I will highlight the steps that we're taking to counter these issues. But I would like to highlight that when we decided to open borders on July 15th, our main focus was that the country should not suffer economically because we are afraid to take the risk, at the same time have the precautions in place, and also to lead from the front to kickstart aviation. Qatar Airways, Emirates, and Etihad Airways, they all started coming in. Turkish Airlines had been providing cargo to us previously before starting opening the borders on the July 15th. So that approach helped us to certainly put us on the map and say, look, Maldives is your dream destination. We are open. And the reason why we open is because of our geographical dispersion. When I say this, I think the numbers don't really elaborate the picture of how the COVID situation is here. We might see about 100 cases or 90 cases daily, but the cases that are arising and the cases that are being publicized are those within the city. The city is closed off. The capital is Malé, is closed off to tourists. So the tourists are not going to come in contact with the community spread. Although now that we've allowed tourists to come in, they might be importing cases, but that is still being taken care of because we do take vitals of the passengers when they come in. Anyone with symptomatic conditions are being quarantined at the facility, at the resort. So they're still being able to enjoy the holiday while being in quarantine. So there's been certain unique steps that has been taken by the Maldivian government, and I'll elaborate on it further in my next opportunity. But that's kind of the idea that has been going around in the government, and that's our approach to fighting the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghani. Thank you very much for that insights. The next speaker is Mr. Andre Biljoen from the Fiji Airways.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the privilege to share our Survive and Thrive strategy and actions. We have our presentation up, please. We go to the next slide. The next one. Next one, please. Fiji Airways has, for the past 6 years, consistently delivered on its strategic role, which is consistent with the founding principles, which is to be an airline with a sustained profitability, supporting inbound tourism, and growing with smart investment. As you can see from the first part of the slide, in 2019, we brought in 65% of the tourists to Fiji. We're the largest generator of foreign exchange with a $1 billion, in excess of a $1 billion turnover. Tourism is 40% of the GDP, and we play a very crucial role in our link to the South Pacific. Country like Tuvalu and Christmas Island, we're the only airline to operate there, and we provide direct connections for all the South Pacific countries to Australia, New Zealand, the USA, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. You heard from the earlier discussions, all airlines have been severely impacted by COVID-19, and we no exception. Our borders are closed to all the countries we serve. 95% of our international passenger flights are suspended. And we followed an approach where we're actually suspending 1 month at a time. We started initially with April and May, and we now have reached September. The reason for this is we want to be, it must be possible for us at the moment there's an easing of border restrictions that we can urgently sell and commence operating. Our revenue is largely zero, and our monthly recurring fixed costs on the 1st of April this year, when we shut down our international flights, was 38 million a month. We've managed through actions that you'll see shortly to bring that down to 20 million a month. Next slide, please. In setting our strategy to survive and thrive, we obviously quickly realized that if you're looking to become future fit, your historic vision and mission no longer applies. So we got the top 50 leaders and managers in our organization together. We engaged and collaborated, and we came up with our common purpose, often called a shared purpose, which is come together to ensure Fiji Airways survives and thrives. Using our proven grit of passion, resilience, perseverance, and resourcefulness to continue to punch above our weight and ensure that we survive and thrive. Next slide, please. So our first survive action started in March 20 when we suspended our April and May international flights. We started reducing costs across the board. We put our aircraft into storage programs to save costs. We took initial steps to reduce employment costs, cut executive salaries by 35%, put all our staff on leave without pay for 4 weeks over 3 months. We then started preparing a wide range of cash forecasts with various assumptions on how long COVID-19 will last and the expected ramp up. In the end, we chose our worst case as our base case to determine the financing we needed to acquire in order to bolster our reserves, because simply put, our cash reserves on the 1st of April with 38 million a month that we have to pay as recurring fixed costs every month wouldn't last very long. These worst case cash forecasts have been independent validated by a leading merchant bank and aviation consultancy. We also immediately approached all our bankers, including other banks in Fiji, and found very little appetite to support us, which I think is common across the world. We therefore had to turn to the government of Fiji, which is also our majority shareholder, for support. Next slide, please. In April, because Fiji was largely COVID contained, we commenced domestic operations. Our domestic operations are only 6% of our business. We also commenced freight operations. We're flying currently 3 times a week to Auckland, twice a week to Sydney and Los Angeles, once a week to Hong Kong and Port Vila, and the purpose is to enable exports to be taken out of the country, which is largely fresh produce, garments, cargo, and seafood, and to bring in essential supplies. Next slide. Obviously, in May, we realized that the borders weren't going to open up for a long time, and we then started further survival actions. We decided to take further cut employment costs further. We terminated 8 expatriate executives. All employees took a permanent 20% pay cut across the board. 50% of our employees who had no work were terminated. That was 758 employees. And we terminated the contracts of all foreign pilots. There were 79 of them. Today, we still have in our employment our local pilots, and there are 103 of them. We set a cost reduction program of 30%, and very importantly, obtained support, which we're very grateful for, from our government to enable us to obtain new loans, and importantly, aircraft loan and rental deferrals with government guarantees of 455 million. Just an important point, aircraft lessors and even the banks were happy to give us 3 and 6 months deferrals, but then immediately repayable after those 3 or 6 months, and this doesn't help. With our government guarantees, we've managed to get 9 to 12 months loan payment and also rental deferrals on our aircraft, which are repayable over 6 years. All these loans that we obtained, our new loans, have repayment periods from 6 to 15 years to give us a lot of time to recover. And for the first 2 years, we only service interest. Next slide, please. We work very closely with the government of Fiji, and we're very pleased that in June, they issued a recovery framework where they've defined that in the future, when borders ease up for contained countries, there's a protocol of how travelers would come in and out the country. They would PCR test 48 hours before flying to Fiji. Once they arrive here, we have the vitals tested, and then they're free to travel with no quarantine. If it's a less contained country, they have the same PCR testing, and when they arrive here, they go into what we call a VIP lane. This lane would be separate access and control on the ground to resorts that are isolated, effectively a form of quarantine, and they would travel back through that VIP lane. Very successfully, government has implemented this currently for yachts. It's called our blue lanes, which allows yachts to come to Fiji. The people on the yacht quarantine on the yacht for 14 days, and then they're free to move around. To date, we have over 40 yachts that have cleared on this basis, and we believe that there's a waiting list of over 100. In the same framework, government introduced the Bulla Bubble focus, which is where, talking to both Australia and New Zealand, we believe that going forward, there may be an opportunity to create a unique framework or basically a travel corridor between Fiji, Australia, and or New Zealand, and for people to travel freely between the countries on holiday. We're obviously targeting this as a very important step. The same concept has been provided for in this economic framework for what's called the Pacific Highway, for this type of VIP corridor or corridor to travel to be opened with many South Pacific countries. Next slide, please. So you'll see from the previous slides that we took many actions to survive. Sum it up, a lot of cost cutting. We've reduced our monthly recurring fixed costs that we have to pay out from a cash perspective from 38 million to 20 million a month. We've obtained what I call long-term aircraft rent and loan repayment deferrals. And we've also arranged new financing with the support of our government, guaranteeing 455 million of this financing. These steps give us the comfort that Fiji Airways has the necessary reserves to tide us through COVID-19. And as you heard from all the other presenters, the key question is, how do we open borders and how do we thrive thereafter? So obviously, we don't open borders, those are government decisions, but as the national airline, we work closely with our government and support them wherever we can to engage with the other governments to ensure that we accelerate the opening of these borders. In the interim, we have our own Thrive strategy, and that is to be ready. Travel ready, commercial ready, ready in every sense of the word. And as you heard earlier, I mentioned that we've kept our airline schedules posted and we only suspend or cancel them month by month, so that the moment there's any sign of borders opening, we can sell and fly. From a travel ready, we have introduced world-class health and safety and risk mitigation measures. We've employed a full-time doctor. We are employing customer wellness champions who will basically be active on the ground and in the air to ensure that our risk mitigation and health and safety measures are followed. We've trained all the staff in the company on these measures, and we're working widely with the industry in Fiji to ensure the others align with our Travel Ready program. We own our own flight academy in Fiji, where we have an A330 and a Boeing simulator, and the pilots that we've retained, which are local pilots, are constantly being kept current, and we're also doing a lot of upgrading and training. On the commercial ready front, we're very pleased that the government of Fiji has seen the necessity in assisting us to create holiday packages the moment there's any easing of border restrictions, for us to attract and entice the maximum number of visitors back to Fiji. Government has reduced departure tax by $100 per passenger. ECAL has been reduced by 5%, that was a tax. STT, a further tax of 6% eliminated, and a wide range, almost 1,500 import excise and duty reductions have been made to ensure that the goods and services in the country are substantially cheaper. Government has also given us $60 million, consisting of a stipend of $400 per passenger. For the first 150,000 passengers we entice back to Fiji, to create attractive and heavily discounted holiday packages. We've been working with the hotels in a task force to put this all together, and together with Tourism Fiji, in a joint campaign, we are very ready to bring the maximum visitors back. So this is our Thrive actions we've been working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Velojoen, for sharing your survival actions. Very interesting for us. The next speaker is Renee Hopsticken from NACO.
Well, good morning from the Netherlands, and thank you for having me in the show. In the next 5 slides, I will shine a light on the vision on how the COVID pandemic is developing from a consultant point of view. Next slide, please. The current layout of the typical layout of airports that we see today are the result of some big events that have been happening in the past in combination with technology. For example, what we see here, the first passenger boarding bridge in San Francisco, when it was applied, it, for example, lifted up the passengers level to the first floor and separating them from the ground handling activities. That impacted an airport layout. If you look at the left bottom, it's the result of a series of plane hijackings in the late 60s. There was the introduction of security checkpoints at airports. There's also a big impact, and that we see until today. On the right top is LAX, the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1984. It was a huge mess in the terminal because all the check-in desks were fixed per airline. And that event really sparked the development of common use terminal equipment, where multiple airlines can use one check-in desk. And on the right bottom, you see the baggage labels, which are the result of the Lockerbie and an Air India bombing on a plane where passengers checked in their luggage but didn't step on the plane, and the bomb went off. It led to the requirement for passenger bag reconciliation and the development of the license plate code on bag tags. And that enabled baggage handling automation at airports. Now, these are all events that have created airports as we see them now. Next slide, please. So here you see an image of a typical airport layout with where all these processes are also in it. You see the check-in desks, security lanes. You see baggage handling systems, mostly below the passenger level. This is a typical layout, and this was the typical layout that we had before COVID struck. And you see how many processes we already have, and you have queuing, and airports were really already very overcrowded. Next slide, please. So now we are in the emergency phase, let's say, for the pandemic. It's still spreading uncontrolled, and also the traffic figures are down. And as we have been discussing before, the measures that are taken, I think all the airports, they have the recommendations from ICAO and IATA on health and cleanliness at the airport and in the airplanes. They're all taken and they're all well in place. But what the airports and airlines need to cope with is all the requirements that are put on top by governments. In particular, Europe is, for example, is quite messy. If you look at airports, there are all kinds of regulations, and they are all different by country. And that leads to additional checkpoints that need to pop up at an airport for only one flight, and then they can disappear again. And airlines and airports need to cope with it. And also, it's very uncertain for passengers to travel. And we want to win back the passenger. But all these different regulations, they make it very difficult and very uncertain for them to get back. So internationally coordinated and clear health requirements are really a necessity for the industry again, I think. Next slide, please. So looking at the mid and the long term, we believe that out of the chaos that we are having today, there will be some more clarity. And we think that the focus of airports and airlines will be among these six items. First is the health registration. We hope that health testing is not going to be required at airports, but that it can be done remotely, and that a record can be kept and shown at the airport to be able to travel. Then you have flexibility and quick response. There might be a second wave, or airports need to upscale or downscale their capacities. So you need to be very flexible, and also you need to have suitable locations and suitable areas where you can do additional checks or additional registration that is required for travel. Then cleanliness will still be on top of the agenda even after COVID may fade out. I think it's good for the trust in the industry, and items that you might see is touchless processing, off-airport processing, but also HVAC systems at airports could be equipped with filters. For restart of travel, passenger flow management is very important, especially with 1.5 meter distancing and the reduced capacities that are used now. But when it starts increasing, it can also become very crowded. So passenger flow management and dynamic wayfinding will be a topic. Now, I mentioned before, the passenger experience is under pressure. That will also be on the agenda of airlines. Passengers are uncertain. They have a lot of steps to take before flying. So it would be good if that can be improved. And last but not least, the financial situation of airlines and airports is very dire, and they will be looking for cost savings. Next slide, please. Taking all this in mind, we still see that there is maybe also an opportunity for change. It's not only bad. We are in a bad situation, but there might be light at the end of the tunnel. What I showed in the first black and white images, these major events that changed the airport layout. Well, it's likely that COVID-19 now is also an event that's going to be a push towards a different airport layout. And here's an indication of how it could look like. With those black and white images, most of the technology was already there, and the events that happened just gave it a push to become widely accepted. If we're looking at the technologies that are here now, like biometric processing, two-step check-in, and remote processing, all these kind of things. Taking that in mind, an airport layout could look something like on this image, where you have one single checkpoint for the entire passenger journey, automated and very fast. You have off-airport processing, so there's very little area where passengers need to queue and need to wait in line. There's a lot of space cleared up. It can be used for commercial or for services, additional services at an airport, and of course also for the ad hoc procedures. In order to achieve this state of the airport, you need a very good roadmap, and you need to have all stakeholders involved and all have the nose in the same direction. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Renee, for sharing those insights. So we're a little bit running over here, so we try to make the part 2 panel discussion a little bit short. So I reduced the some of these questions I have was multi-part, so I just make a single questions. Hope that's okay. So let's begin with part 2 panel discussion. So the first question is addressed to Mr. Arun Mishra, and this is what is the role of the Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, also known as CART, which is a platform for governments and industry operators to restart international aviation.
Thank you, Dongyu. As I mentioned briefly in my presentation at the beginning, the CART is basically a platform created by ICAO in consultation with all the stakeholders to tide through this crisis. So it covers various aspects of the problem, safety, security, public health, as well as economic aspects of the problems faced by the industry. So we have specific recommendations, and but we have not, and it's a living document, so we are constantly working and updating it. So second phase of CART deliberations already started. What is important is that while we understand that the bigger states can implement those measures effortlessly, but the smaller states in the region will face problems. So we have started, as you know, like ADB and World Bank, we also work very closely with our states, and the states' needs are being identified, and then we are developing tailor-made solutions to address those needs. So, for example, there is a problem in small states, like say Nepal or Bangladesh, they don't have flight simulators. And the pilots, while we have given them an exemption for 6 months, that time is going out. So the pilots need to be proficient. Otherwise, they'll lose their recency. They cannot fly. And we cannot keep on allowing them exemption from these checks. So now we have to find a way where these pilots can travel to countries where these facilities are available, as they have been doing in the past. And that's a challenge, because most of these countries have closed their borders. So we need to start negotiating. Secondly, what we are doing apart from the CART is developing some implementation packages. Though it came in slightly late, because we also had to develop this. But now these are very useful guidance in a package kind of thing, where you have expert help and workshop, training, etc. for the staff, so that they can sort of get into the work of restart and recovery. So that's, apart from this, this is a new normal. And as you know, aviation has to keep on working on the various technical work which we are doing in normal times. So we have started also doing our normal work through the virtual platform. So all our meetings and engagement with the states and industry, that's going on, so that when this crisis gets over, there's no gap in what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra. The second question is addressed to Mr. Charles Schlumberger from the World Bank. And my question is, in addition to the financial support, is there a more active role that the multi-development banks can play?
I think the answer is financial support is probably the behind the two first one. One is policy advice, and the other one is technical support. We don't shine by having, a portfolio of about 300 billion in development, but we shine because we have in all sectors specialists that provide technical advice. And as I explained, we are actually going hands-on in the case I mentioned Uzbekistan, where we help the government and we help the airline to restructure and to get to international standards. So the answer is yes. First, technical and policy advice, if needed, financial support.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. The next question I have is to Mr. Patrick Osawe. And this is, given the numerous unknowns around new diseases such as COVID-19, what are the crucial factors for restoring confidence in air travel?
I think the the biggest challenge is that states are making decisions not together, but as individual states. So for example, some states require a COVID test, and we just heard from Maldives that that's not a requirement. Some states require COVID tests done within 48 hours. In some countries, like here where we live in the Philippines, it takes about 120 hours to get a COVID test, or a COVID test on average. It could be less depending on where you go, but on average is about 5 days. And so with all those challenges, without very clear coordination, it becomes very difficult to jumpstart aviation very quickly because of these government measures that are in place. Because if it was easier, whereby you know that you'll go into a country and then you can get out, and you can get a COVID test within a short period of time, can come back to your country if that's a requirement, that's a challenge. So the government measures that are problematic. The second part is that about 40 to 50% of people with COVID are asymptomatic. And some of them are shedding infections and so on. And so the challenge that we are facing is that we need to have to use all the public health measures that are standard to avoid being infected. The good news is that within the aircraft technology and so on, the HEPA filter, the filter that's used in the aircraft, is so superior to even the air that you actually breathe outside. So there's almost zero recorded infection in the aircraft as we know it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. The next question is to Mr. Hamad Abdul Ghani. And this is, how will the pandemic affect the long-term policies and strategies of Maldives?
Thank you, Don. So, like I highlighted earlier as well, the Maldives is unique in its geography and the situation that we're in as well. I think Arun also mentioned that they're taking certain steps to navigate through to become normal in these abnormal times. And those are one of the issues that we are facing, to make sure that the airline industry and the aviation industry has is still following the safety precautions, safety standards of the industry in its essence. Because when we do restart aviation, that's going to be one of the key things to avoid any sort of mishap going forward. Once we recover, we want things to go smoothly. And then, like Aaron mentioned, that is one of the work that ICAO is doing in partnership with the DGCAs. One of the key strategies that the Maldives should really be working, and we are trying to get it through, is diversification. I think aviation, being such a huge part, has also had its fallbacks for the country, because we've relied on one industry for the economic growth. We are trying to diversify our production. We're trying to move into other industries so that aviation will prosper, but alongside with it, other industries will also take off. I've got a few questions from the participants as well. I would like to touch down on them, basically to give an outset of how Maldives is dealing with the current situation. When tourists come in, they're being taken from the airport to the resorts. So they're on a unique, dispersed island where it's not linked to the city. So the community spread does not really affect the tourists. And that is the reason why we did not require COVID tests or quarantine, because they're, in its essence, they're quarantined anyway, away from the capital and away from the general population. But we've also put in measures such as the staff at the resorts will not be able to go back without a 14-day quarantine to any other island. People living in the capital are not allowed to go into resorts. So the chance for community spread is very, very low, unless you come into contact with someone at the airport who might be carrying the virus. But at the same time, anyone who becomes positive is being isolated in the resort in its essence and in itself, and they are being catered to separately, and they're still able to enjoy their holiday with whoever they're with. But at the same time, the precautions are in place. We've taken calculated risks, and I think that is one of the key things for countries with tourism and it as its main income source can do, is to start off with a calculated approach to make sure that the economy keeps growing and the aviation industry prospers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghani. So the final question is just to Renee Hopstecken. And this is, what are the trends for the development of the technologies supporting international aviation to reopen? How will they interact with practices of the industry? And are there some solid cases with quick wins to be shared? Renee, I think you're muted.
Yes. It's quite early in reopening, although we do see some technologies that are quite successful. For example, the check-in kiosks where you can take over the menu with your mobile phone. That's a very easy technology that can be retrofitted on existing kiosks, and you see several airlines and airports engaging in those solutions. So you have a touchless experience at an airport. And some other smaller items that you see is, for example, UVC cleaning and sanitation of, for example, the trays at the security lanes, because those are the ones that most passengers are all touching. But if we look at a larger scale, there were trends that were actually already happening before COVID outbreak, and which will be maybe amplified now. One of them is, for example, two-step check-in, which enables remote labeling of your bags. And at the airport, you only need to drop your bag. This, for example, it reduces queues and touch points. And another, and that's maybe the most important one, is biometric processing in combination with the digital identity of passengers. This system, if you have it in place, it can also combine very well with medical details of passengers. If passengers have done tests, then it can be registered, that it can be attached to their biometric details and their digital identity, and with that they can be ready to travel, and they can have a touchless experience at an airport. And in particular, the medical status should be registered. There's a development called Common Pass by the World Economic Forum and Rockefeller Foundation. And they are, for example, setting up a database amongst all the countries to register what kind of tests, what kind of COVID tests are acceptable, what kind of test and maybe test institutions are acceptable by a nation, and then they can register if the passenger has been tested accordingly. And that can be attached to your digital identity. So those things, I think, will definitely help to enable traffic again, but it will be for the longer term, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Renee. Very useful. So with this, we can now begin the final part 3 with questions and answers with the audience. So I think we're okay on time. I think we reduced the delay a little bit. So I'll go through the questions we have received. I'll go to them in the order, the first come, first served. So the first question is for Patrick Osawe, and the question is, the new trend of the second wave of COVID-19 is no symptoms, and people tend to feel that the virus is no longer exists. We need to redesign the passengers' glow in terminal. Is there any new standard related to this?
I'm not sure I understand what is meant by glow in terminal.
Okay.
It's not clear to me, so maybe perhaps I can paraphrase the question.
Okay, maybe Kwan Chang can maybe seek clarification on that while we move to the next question. Is for the Charles from World Bank. How COVID-19 could affect aviation in the long run, where a huge number of flights has canceled, no income but huge expenditure.
We are talking about aviation. We are not talking about airlines. Many airlines will disappear. New ones will come. You know, this is not my main worry. The world has a very high level of debt. What is the world GDP? It's about 70 trillion. Debt is over 260 trillion. That's public debt, private debt, corporate debt. The aviation sector is primarily affected by the economy. It was growing twice the world GDP for a few years, but in average, it was always growing world GDP. If the financial sector collapses because too much debt and a very long recession or even depression, all the sectors are affected. Mostly airlines, which already are in very difficult situation and which are not a good investment. Airlines are not a profitable investment. At best, they earn their weighted cost of average weighted cost of capital. So the answer is very straightforward. It really depends. If we recover, if the world economy stays stable, if the money printing that was going on is still going on in an exorbitant way in the United States, Europe, and other places, does not lead to hyperinflation or depression, but to a stable situation and back to where we were, then the aviation sector is recovering. Some of the airlines disappear, some will be restructured, some survive. We had a very good example of Fiji Airways, what needs to be done. But the big question is the big picture.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. The next question is for Andre, Fiji Airways. And this is, has Fiji considered the 4 to 10 cycle suggested by Israel's Science Institute? Accept tourists for 4 days only, or adopt 14-day mandatory stay as a quarantine while in a resort?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, Fiji has its own framework of how they're going to handle tourists from contained and less contained countries. We will certainly pass this suggestion on to government. It may be a further thing that they can explore.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Arun, IKO. Public acceptance for revival of aviation sector is a must, as you have highlighted. However, how can that be planned in the backdrop that the general public opinion is of the view that the COVID situation could have been controlled effectively at the initial stage itself, had the airlines, the airports, and the aviation sector as a whole taken and implemented preventive and confinement measures sincerely?
Thank you. I don't agree with this premise that the preventive measures needed to be taken by the airports and airlines. It's the government which are primarily responsible, because the pandemic was such that no one could predict how it's going. So it is not the sole responsibility of the airlines or the airports and others in the aviation sector to have closed the borders or done all those kind of things which is happening now. Having said that, I think it's more important if you're looking at revival. Yes, agreed that public confidence is very important. But if you see the countries where the domestic travel has started, the passenger load is quite good. I think 60 to 70% people are planes are full wherever the domestic flights are available. So I don't see so much of a problem of public confidence. People are sitting in rows of 3 next to each other with a mask. So I think it's more important that government at the topmost level realize the importance of a risk-based approach to dealing with this problem of opening up borders. And we've got excellent examples from Maldives and Fiji. And today, if you've read the newspaper, Thailand Prime Minister came out in a statement that they have to open the country for tourism. And he has gone in details to lay out the risk-based measures which would be implemented in very much close to in line with what Fiji and Maldives are planning to do and get passengers in phases and open the country for this kind of travel. So I think I would also like to respond to the question which Charles posed to Charles about the future of the aviation industry. I would say that I'm quite optimistic, and we have seen not such a big crisis, but we have seen similar kind of crisis in the past. And aviation is a very resilient industry. People need to travel, people need to fly. So at the end, it will be all right. I think we will be able to go over this crisis. So we should maybe some changes, but then we will be back to where we were in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra. The next question is for Renee. Low-cost carriers have been the main driving force of the industry for the past several decades. What are your viewpoints about the future of the low-cost carriers?
Okay, of course, I'm not an economist like Charles, but I think if we look at the list, for example, that Charles presented, there were quite a few low-cost airlines on that list, and also if we look at the decision tree that he showed, are the low-cost airlines vital for the economy of a country, then they may get government fundings. And I think it's likely for low-cost carriers that they may not be entitled to get government funding, so they will have to do it on their own. Well, the nature of low-cost carriers is, of course, that they are very lean and mean organizations, so they are able to scale down quickly, and they also often like to use high-tech solutions. And they are very much into self-service, and these kind of things will help to reduce costs and to scale down quickly. So. Difficult to say. It will depend also on how quickly they can adjust their running costs. What we did see with the full service carriers at this moment, they grabbed the COVID situation to move towards the services provided by low-cost carriers. So now the bigger carriers, they are starting to think, oh, maybe we should provide self-service to passengers because it's touchless, and of course also a way to reduce costs. So the full service carriers, they are considering to move towards low-cost carriers, I think.
Okay. Next two questions are for Hamad from Maldives. First is, has Maldives offered any subsidy to resorts, either to survive or reduce operating costs?
Yes, we have. We have given out stimulus packages to the resorts and also the employees who actually lost their jobs. If you look at the aviation sector, the pilots who've been laid off, like Andre said, where Fiji Airways also laid off their foreign pilots first. In the national interest, we also had to take that decision, which was hard because these are pilots who've also been helping build our national airline and our air transport infrastructure and the industry. But we laid off the foreign pilots first because they were on contract basis and they were happy to take it rather than taking a pay cut. So we made those arrangements, and then for those pilots who lost their jobs, we've given them income support allowances. And I would like to highlight that my minister, the Minister for Transport and Civil Aviation, Ms. Aishat Naula, she has given out an incentive and advised the Civil Aviation Authority and the Economic Ministry in the Maldives that when the aviation restarts in the Maldives, give preference to the locals to make sure that their jobs are secured and that the burden of stimulus packages on the government's finance is lower. To briefly sum up, yes, we have been giving stimulus packages and it's looking like it's going to pay off. Thank you.
Okay, the second question for you is also regarding Maldives. The number of confirmed cases from the beginning of the pandemic in July 15th was around 700, and from 15th of August is now more than 2,800. Is the percent increase due to opening the borders?
No, I can definitely say that it's not because of opening the border. I'll pull up the latest update from last night. So we've got totally 7,225 confirmed cases in the Maldives. And when I say in the Maldives, the cases that are confirmed are concentrated in the city, the capital itself, which is closed off to tourists. Tourists have no way of coming into the city where the community spread is going on. In the city, we've got a lot of restrictions in place. Masks are mandatory. Unlike other countries you've seen in Europe, masks are mandatory here because we believe that if the citizens are wearing their masks, the spread would definitely come down drastically. And I think Patrick would agree that those are the measures that have really changed the outset of certain countries. Say, for example, the UK as well. And UK did not first ask the citizens to wear masks. But when they started, we've seen a difference because it protects the person carrying the virus and the person who is unaffected as well. So having two barriers helps protect each other. So those are the kind of steps that we've taken to make sure that the community spread doesn't get affected to the tourist industry. And I can definitely say that no, the spread has not increased because of opening the borders, because what happened alongside opening the borders was to kickstart the economy. We also took off the lockdown measures, which allowed people to move freely. Before July 15th, we had a lockdown, a partial lockdown in the country where people were not able to move around freely. They were not able to go from a person's house to the other or go to work. But now we've opened it up, and that is where we are seeing this issue. And I mean, at the cost of being critical at my own policies and our own policies in the country, I'd like to say that when we opened up on July 15th, we did not have masks mandatory. And that is one of the issues where the rise in cases were seen, but we've now imposed the mandatory mask policy and it's paying off. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We do have a question going back to Patrick, and this is quite interesting. Is there a chance that the vaccine of COVID-19 remain unavailable for a time longer than expected, say 3 years? In this case, how should governments and airlines be prepared for coping with such challenge?
Thank you very much. Mr. Ghani, I'm the one who asked that question on Maldives, because I think you're doing an outstanding job in Maldives as an example to many countries. And the increase in number of cases is something that we see in many countries, including India, that now they are reported about 65,000 cases every day, and it's not because of travel. So that was just to clarify, because people have been asking that question, and I'm glad that we clarified it very well, and that we just have to continue using protection. Countries that suffered from previous pandemics like SARS, H1N1, that people have the culture of using masks, we see that the number of COVID cases have been very, very limited compared to countries that did not have that experience. So now in terms of vaccines, so there are about 165 vaccines that are under trial. Of those, about 27 of them are in clinical trial, meaning that they've already started testing those on human beings. The first cohort of tests will be available, perhaps the first test will be available in the first quarter of 2021. If all the other tests that you hear are almost there, they still have to go through certain steps that you cannot have a shortcut. And so the challenge is that for vaccines, the requirement, rather, you'd have to, if the vaccine is available, that is just the first step. The second step is how do you vaccinate billions and billions of people across the world, more or less around the same time. They just will not have sufficient number of vaccines to do that. So the second cohort of vaccines will be available sometime towards the third quarter of next year. So the big challenge is how do you, currently what WHO and others have recommended is that the first quarter is to vaccinate health workers because they're more exposed and other people who are at high risk. And then second, the people with a pre-existing condition, that's only about 5 to 20% of the population. The challenge is how do you do that en masse? So I think that in terms of travel, the most important thing is to make testing available. Testing is still unavailable in many countries, and it's important that we all work together, development banks and also the member countries, to make it easier, faster, and so on. There's a lot of innovation that's going on. We are currently discussing with a technology company in Australia that has come up with an antigen test. It's a test, and you can show a BPC, and it's simple as a pregnancy test, and you can know your results in about 15 to 20 minutes. It's being field tested from next week in Bangladesh, and so on. So the amount of technology that's and innovation going on over the next several months in terms of diagnostics, we'll be able to have sufficient number of tests to be able to know whether someone is infected or not. And secondly, and lastly, is that we have to continue using the measures that have been used, that have been very successful. And in that regard, the initial question about the flow of passengers within the airport, there's been a lot of redesigning of classrooms, of restaurants, and so on. And in the aviation industry, the redesigning of airports, and also in some of the airlines, they have a free middle seat policy, which of course is a challenge because if you do that, the occupancy of the aircraft is just around 65%, which is not profitable for the airline. Like Charles had indicated, that the airline is not such a big profitable business anyway. So there's a lot of innovation to try and see how you can prevent infection across the various stages of traveler's journey. Over.
Thank you, Patrick, for going back and just addressing that first question. Thank you. So with this, we're almost at 10 minutes over, so not so bad. So before closing this session, I just wanted to thank the wonderful speakers who donated their time and the audience who provided very insightful questions. For me, as we close, well, the big question I had in my mind all this time was basically how quickly and to what extent air travel can resume and recover. Obviously, some personal interest there. I don't think there is any, real, the answer actually to that is very complex one. I think it all depends on the how rigorous we are in terms of actions taken to minimize damage to economic activities without increasing the risk to health. And I think this has a lot of aspects, and there's a lot of aspects, including international coordination facilitated by organizations like ICAO, assistance from multilateral development banks like the World Bank and ADB, health experts, policies of governments, initiatives, airline, as we heard before, survive initiatives for initiatives to survive and thrive, and also technological advances highlighted by Renee as well. So I think it all depends on those factors, and hope we will make progress in the near future. So with this, we will close the session. Thank you once again, and you may now leave the Zoom session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Don.
Bye-bye.